there's always been a lot of discussion about whether or not the iPad, especially the iPad Pro, could replace a MacBook. I've tried this myself a couple of times in the past, first when the Magic Keyboard came out in 2020, and most recently with the M4 iPad Pro that came out in 2024. It hasn't really worked out for me, so today I want to talk a little bit about why I would like it to work, why it hasn't really worked for me, and whether it could work for you. Whenever anyone has had a chance to ask this to an Apple executive, they usually reply with something like, I love both of them, they do different tasks, I like both of them for what they do best, just something like that, basically boiling down to telling you to buy both. I don't know if that's what they actually believe, or if they just don't want to tell you that one of them could eventually replace the other one, and they just don't want to cannibalize the Mac sales by telling you that the iPad will be better eventually. But anyways, that's their stance on it. To me, that doesn't really make a lot of sense when I consider that the 13-inch iPad Pro with a Magic Keyboard is almost the same weight and size of the MacBook Air 13-inch, which can do many more things that the iPad can't do with the same chip, with the same hardware, basically also a trackpad, keyboard, screen. It's basically the same thing. So for me, if I have both, I always have to decide which one I will bring. And if I have to go out, I don't want to bring both all of the time. And if I have to decide, 99% of the times I will go for the MacBook. And saying that they're distinct platforms just because they do slightly different things, to me is a bit like saying the iPod Touch and the iPhone back in the day were the same thing, and you should have both because one is better at playing music. I know that iPod Touch and iPhone had the same OS, so it was a bit different, but still, it's weird to have two devices that are the same size, have the same hardware features, but can't do the same things. Now, I don't want to argue to put macOS on the iPad. I know some people do this, but to me, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because I like the iPad to be something different. If I want an iPad with macOS, I would rather wish for a MacBook with a touchscreen, if that makes sense. So I would really like it to become a different platform, more modern and just, a new concept compared to the Mac. But right now, it's just nowhere close to that.
And this transformation is going to make some people uneasy. People from the PC world, like you and me. It's going to make us uneasy because the PC's taken us a long ways.
I remember an interview with Steve Jobs from 2010 where he was talking about tablet PCs versus personal computers / Macs. And he was basically comparing Macs to trucks and tablets to cars. And he was saying that just like with agriculture, basically everyone needed a truck. We did a lot of work outside. And then we shifted towards more knowledge work and living in cities where cars became much more useful. And now we have like a 1:25, 1:30 ratio of trucks to cars. And the same was going to happen with tablets and laptops, where laptops are like the trucks that will always be there. You will always be able to get one. But it will just be for the people that need a really, really heavy-duty, all-purpose vehicle, basically. And most of the people will be happy with having a more lightweight, kind of more elegant solution in the tablet to fulfill most of their computing needs. And it really makes sense to me. The only problem with that is that right now, the way the iPad works and the way the software is working, it feels a bit more like the iPad is a convertible, but without a roof, and you can use it for a few sunny days every year, but you can't really replace your truck with it. Saying that like some of the tasks I do are really nice on the iPad, but most of them just don't work, so it would never be able to replace a MacBook. And in that sense, I think it's time to make it more into that replacement for the laptop, give it the missing features, and just make sure that it can actually be that for most people, because I think it actually has the potential. Why I want to have this is the fact that the iPad hardware is basically, I think, if you put the Vision Pro aside, the most impressive hardware that Apple makes. It's crazy thin, much smaller than a laptop, but packs basically the same performance in there, has the best displays that Apple offers. It has Face ID, which the MacBook doesn't have. And most importantly, it's really flexible. You can just have it like this, just hold it, really thin, light tablet. You can put it on the keyboard. Now you have basically a laptop form factor. You can use a pencil. You can basically adapt it to whatever your needs are in any situation. And that's what makes it so great to me. And it's like this future vision. Apple even talked about this in 2024 when the new iPad Pro came out, that you just have this sheet of glass where it's just a display and you can do whatever you want with it. So to me, it would be really nice if it was enabled to replace most of the MacBook's tasks and become more of a viable computing platform as a replacement and not as a companion for the Mac. So let's talk a bit more specifics of why it doesn't work currently. In some ways, it works really well. If I need to write emails, deal with a to-do list, just write a text document, journal, whatever, the iPad is great and it would always be the first thing I would use. But for everything that goes beyond that, it's just a mess and it gets so annoying so quickly that it's just not fun to use and not really viable as an alternative. I know that there's the story that the iPad's performance is kind of held back by missing software, which has been kind of the popular narrative for a while now. And I think it is true in some ways, but maybe not in the way you might think. So I would say the problem is not that the iPad is lacking professional software to utilize the performance it has gotten. We have Final Cut Pro now, for example, and you also have DaVinci Resolve, and you have many more professional apps where you can actually really push the iPad and really enjoy the performance you have with these M4 chips now and there. To me, the problem is more in the many paper cuts you will experience just using it regularly. It's not really complicated stuff. It's more like the day-to-day stuff, copying, pasting, and just stuff like that that doesn't work the way you expect and also doesn't work the way it should. Now, I know that adapting to a new OS can always take time, so I'm not really talking about that. Take Final Cut, for example. I tried Final Cut on the iPad and I edited some videos with it, and of course you have to relearn some shortcuts, some things are in different places, and that's really not what I'm talking about. If I stick with Final Cut as an example, the stuff I'm talking about is that there's no LUTs, for example. You can't apply LUTs, which is a really basic feature in any video editor. So you can't really use log footage from your cameras in the same way as you can on the MacBook. The same goes for exporting videos. If you export a video in Final Cut and you want to do something else, the export will stop. You have to keep Final Cut open and you can't do anything but stare at the progress bar. And that's with a modern iPad with an M4 chip, 16 gigabytes of RAM. It just doesn't make sense. And the worst thing is that when you connect the iPad to an external monitor and you want to use Final Cut in full screen, it just doesn't work. All you can see is a scaled up version of the iPad, like iPad screen, just in big, but it's still the same size. All of the buttons are the same size as on the iPad screen. You can't make it full screen. I don't know how something like that can even exist. And there's so many things that just take way longer to do than on the Mac. For example, I love the new window tiling feature that macOS Sequoia brought. Why isn't it on the iPad? Especially in Stage Manager, it would be so nice to be able to do like a split screen multitasking really quickly and really conveniently. Instead, you have to drag the windows to be the right size, because since it's a very closed platform, you also can't install a third-party extension to kind of do that for you like you could on the Mac before it was part of the OS. The same goes for example, PDF editing. I was reading some like 20, 30 page papers, which is not a long PDF. I was highlighting right in the editor that is in the Files app on the iPad. On the Mac, there's Preview, which is a little bit better because it's a separate app. But on the iPad, you have to open the PDF in the Files app. And then I annotated a lot of it. And at some point, it just crashed. I reopened the PDF, all of my edits are gone. And this happened to me more than once. And if something like that happens like 2-3 times at least, I will just stop using it because it wastes so much time and it's so annoying. So I don't get why stuff like that doesn't work. I don't want to make this like a complete list of everything that's missing because I think you get the picture. It's not really about the big apps that are missing for me. It's more about what breaks in day-to-day use and what gets annoying really quickly, just regularly editing text, just the normal productivity stuff we do. I think one thing I want to talk about though is Safari. It was announced at some point, I don't remember, but I think it was a while back already, that Safari on the iPad has become a desktop grade browser, or at least was supposed to. And it's just not. I mean, in so many places, it's still so close to the iPhone version and so far away from the Mac version. And that's so important, especially nowadays where most of the work I do, and I think many knowledge work people do, is on the web. The most obvious example here is always just using the G Suite like Google Sheets or Google Docs. It's really bad. It's just not nice. It always prompts you to use the app, and the copying and editing of text doesn't really work. The apps aren't better either, so it's just not fun to use, and you can't really do your work in G Suite if you're using that. But the same goes even for some forms on some government websites where you have to fill out your address and stuff like that, where it's not really a optimized like Shopify website for easy checkout, but maybe an older platform. You can always rely on the Mac to be able to use those. The iPad, not so much. Sometimes it just doesn't work, so then you're just out of luck. And even if I consider it as a companion to my Mac, there's still so many inconsistencies which I just don't get. For example, I really like to use mission control on the Mac. I just swipe up with 3 fingers on my trackpad and I get to see all of my open programs. It's really great to get an overview when you're working on a lot of things at the same time. On the iPad, the same gesture just closes the current app. It makes sense because you would also swipe up on the screen to do the same, so it's kind of matching. And I would be okay if the iPad would actually work as a Mac replacement, because then I could just get used to the way that the iPad does things. But if I'm supposed to use it as a companion, I think it would be nicer to have some consistency between the trackpad gestures, because it looks like a MacBook, it feels like a MacBook, so it should work like a MacBook. And mission control is also something that would be really good for the iPad maybe. In Stage Manager, for example, it gets really cluttered really quickly, and it could really use like an overview screen, but it's just not there because the gesture is taken up for something else, and Stage Manager is just lacking features like that to help you manage your open windows. And last but not least, one of the biggest problems is that it feels to me like iPadOS is just the buggiest platform that Apple puts out right now. I have so many issues with external monitor support that I just really stopped using it. It breaks so often in so many random ways. Sometimes I use Command Spacebar to trigger the spotlight search. Sometimes it appears on my iPad, sometimes it appears on my screen. I never really know where it will appear or if it will even work. Sometimes apps just crash, and that's like the system apps like I talked before with the PDF editing in the Files app. It's not third-party apps that crash. And there's too many places where something doesn't work. For example, now I had this issue where I was using a shortcut, and the shortcut puts up a text edit field, but the text editing still happens in the background. The iPad just doesn't switch, and it doesn't let me switch to the foreground either. So iPadOS is also just like the most buggy Apple platform, and that would also keep me from using it as my main computer because I want to be able to rely on my laptop. Alright, so who could make it work to use the iPad as their main computer? I think there's some people for whom it can work. There's just not as many as you might think. So the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, anyone that uses the pencil a lot. I think in general, as a kind of rule, the less you use the iPad in laptop mode, docked to a keyboard, the more happy you will be with it. I think if you use the pencil mostly, you're like a graphic designer or 3D artist or whatever, you will be really happy. You might still want to have a Mac for your admin tasks, but you might be able to get away with just an iPad if most of what you're doing is just using the pencil and you just need to write some emails in between with the keyboard. The iPad could totally work for that. Next up is also people that just don't really like using computers. I think old people often come to mind, but it's not just that. It's also like anyone who just doesn't like the way computers work and just always feels like they're fighting with it. The iPad might be a more intuitive platform and much more approachable because it has touch input and a more intuitive OS. There will be issues if you want to do heavy spreadsheet editing or heavy multitasking, but I think if you want to do those things, you will know. But if you're someone that doesn't get along well with computers, the iPad might be a different route to take and it might be more fun. And if you do like web surfing, reading newspapers, consuming content most of the time, it will be really good. But other than that, I think it's really hard to justify using the iPad as your main computer. And if you're thinking about doing it, I would really encourage you to think twice. If you want to make it work, which I did for various periods over the past years, you have to be a really weird mix of very enthusiastic about tech and kind of willing to find workarounds when something doesn't work and willing to try again and again and again if something breaks. And at the same time, you need to be someone that's looking for a more simple platform and more intuitive, like one task focused platform. So it's kind of a juxtaposition of two things that don't really go together, in my opinion, because if you're enthusiastic about tech, you will mostly also be someone who likes to have control over things and be able to change settings, especially on your laptop or computer. But if you do want to try it, I would just view it as an experiment, and it has some great benefits. As I said, I think the best thing about the iPad is that you just get to do one task in a really focused mode, and you don't have like 20 windows open. When I did it, I never really used Stage Manager. I just use like the normal split screen most of the time because it works really good on the iPad. So if you want to experiment, of course do it. But if you are just trying to get an iPad and not a MacBook and you don't have access to any computer, I would really think twice and maybe go for a Mac first. Especially for students, I think I made a video about this in the past. I just wouldn't recommend it. Like 95% of students will be better off with a MacBook, maybe even more. It's a great secondary device if you take a lot of like handwritten notes and you just want to do that digitally. Of course, then it's absolutely great. But then you don't need an iPad Pro. You can just get a cheap iPad and use the rest of the money to get a better Mac, because you will use that most of the time, most likely. So is the iPad just doomed now? I don't think so. I think it's still a great platform. It was great to see Apple bring out new hardware last year and really keep investing into the platform. I think it's just kind of stuck in an identity crisis right now. There's this original vision of the iPad as this touch-first device that's really intuitive and just something that you hold in your hand. And the potential of the iPad as an all-in-one computing device that's really adaptable, flexible, and can basically do most things for most people. And that's also hard to do as a developer, to decide between those two things, because you want to keep the simplicity and the intuitiveness, and at the same time keep adding more features so that it can be more of a viable Mac replacement for more people. Realizing how unnecessary a bigger iPad is, for me at least, led me to go with the 11-inch and get rid of my 13-inch that I bought when it came out last year. So like a month ago I switched between the two, but I will probably make a separate video about this as kind of a companion if you want to hear about my decision-making process there. But I think right now it's just best as a companion device. It still has a lot of way to go if it wants to be a Mac replacement. And I think the past 4 to 5 years, especially with Apple Silicon, have been really great for the Mac. But at the same time, it seems like the Mac is hitting a ceiling with how far it can go. Laptops feel like they're almost perfect right now, like the new MacBook Pros from 2021. I think people are having a hard time even justifying upgrading them because they are so good and there's not a lot left to do. So I think the iPad could step in and become this new driver of innovation in the laptop form factor. And maybe that can happen if now after this Mac focus, Apple focuses back on the iPad a little bit more, especially in terms of software.
As vehicles started to be used in the urban centers and America started to move into those urban and then suburban centers, cars got more popular, and innovations like automatic transmission and power steering and things that you didn't care about in a truck as much started to become paramount in cars. And now, probably, I don't know what the statistics are, maybe 1 out of every 25 vehicles, 30 vehicles is a truck, where it used to be 100%. PCs are going to be like trucks. They're still going to be around. They're still going to have a lot of value, but they're going to be used by 1 out of X people.
So going back to this Steve Jobs analogy, I think it's just time to let the iPad become this car that's more useful for most people compared to a truck, because right now it's just not. It's way too useless in too many use cases. But I think there's definitely a way where in the next 3 to 4 years it could become that, if they just keep investing in the software and do more with the software. Because right now the hardware is great, we need more software, but not in terms of like big apps. We just need to get the software to a state where it's as stable as the Mac and as useful as the Mac for like day-to-day productivity work, and just get rid of some of those minor annoyances that maybe the iPad has just collected along the way while growing from basically an oversized iPhone into this like laptop replacement platform. I think especially as AI becomes more important, the iPad might be a much more fun computing platform that is better at relying on AI to support your work, because we're already seeing this with what was announced for Apple Intelligence last year at WWDC, that a lot of the integrations look better and work better on iOS. So the iPad has a lot of potential, just needs to be basically allowed to fulfill that potential, and I think then it could become something that the Mac would have never been capable of becoming. So yeah, I hope this actually happens. I hope next year at WWDC we finally see new iPad features and not just a calculator, and then the iPad could leapfrog the Mac and become something that replaces it for most people. For now, we have to wait, but I hope this video helped you out, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.